Welcome to Step Into the Pivot. We're your hosts. I'm Teresa Conti.
And I'm Ivana Polonio. We talk with people just like you. We have honest conversations about current issues that women and men face and how we pivot to address them in our lives.
This podcast is your companion as you step into a workout or take some time for yourself. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Step Into the Pivot. We're so happy to have you here. And we are also happy to have our guest this week, Michael Muirhead. So, Michael, thank you so much for being here and sharing your story with Ivana and I today.
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity, and the platform that you create for these stories is really inspiring. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. We really appreciate you saying that. We love being able to share, people's stories because everybody has every different type of pivot in their life. So we've shared a lot of great stories. So I'm really excited to hear yours today. I always seem to be the one who's surprised and always excited about that. So it's definitely a treat for me. So just really quickly, Michael's been in financial services for probably about 30 years. Started off in advisory, and then has, in the more recent, the past 10 years or so, works for Broadridge and FI360, product management, fiduciary training, designations, certifications. So really some great stuff that's in our industry and that we need. So Ivana, do you want to kick us off with our first question to Michael and kind of do your intro?
Yes, thank you, Teresa. I remember so fondly, Michael, when we first met, because we already had reasons to be working together. So it was retirement services industry as the context, like Teresa just shared, and we had, many different reasons why we were to be work related. However, do you remember how it started? What was the first thing we ever talked about? Because the person introducing us was like, the two of you. Now this is 10 years ago. Do you
Yes,
remember what it was?
I personally didn't remember, but then we had that conversation and absolutely remember the event, and it was a great opportunity to meet you and a lot of other really wonderful financial professionals, and
Yeah.
miss those days.
Yeah, right?
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
I remember it more distinctly than you do because the whole interaction started with someone else approaching me before before we connected, and they said, "Come with me, come with me. There's another person here who does yoga. He does yoga." And they, very, very kindly like dragged me. It was this
Yeah,
like conference setting networking, like,
yeah,
come, come. There's somebody here who does yoga. And
yeah.
I'm chuckling because that was so, like different and unusual because we're talking about 10 plus years ago.
Hmm.
And then that person was just like, you two should talk. Well, it turns out, again, we had all sorts of other things we needed to talk about from a more professional, quote unquote, separating those two out is hard, professional standpoint. But yoga was the first thing we connected on. And then it was like the big topic of the word that was weird at the time, mindfulness.
Hmm.
Just they roll off the tongue more easily these days.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, and that's been, as we talked about, center to my life and sort of my perspective and worldview, with sort of that mindfulness and a lot of other sort of spirituality helping um, on the journey, right? It's always a journey. And so that's what I think we're here to experience. And clearly, I'm on that journey with a pretty a dramatic pivot that we're going to talk about a little bit later here going on in our lives as well.
Well, let's go into it right now. So tell us about the journey you're on right now. And why don't you just tell us the whole thing? I don't need to set that up. You'll do it beautifully. I know that.
Yeah, so anyone that has met me knows that I have a really close core, what we call trio, which includes my partner and our only son. And the big pivot that I'm experiencing, as well as my partner, is that our son has fulfilled one of his many dreams. He has a lot of big dreams, to spend a year in Japan. And he left about 5, 6 weeks ago, and so that's the impetus, the catalyst for our discussion around my personal pivot that's going on right now.
So he left for a year for Japan. Do you think it's only going to be a year? I mean, is that I'm maybe jumping ahead there a little bit, but
Yeah.
I could see as a parent that may be a fear, right? That
Yes.
he loves it so much he may never come back. Not
Yes.
that I'm trying to plant that seed in your head, but I'm sure that's going through your head.
Of course, absolutely. It's something that is always in the back of the mind. And it's so funny because when you start talking to people about this type of experience, um, a lot of stories start to come, and you start to realize how small the world is and how many other people have experienced going over to Japan or going to a foreign country. And one of my colleagues told me about a cousin that went over 30 years ago and never came back. And so you have that idea and notion. And our son, of course, has come across a number of expats that have gone over there and have stayed and started families. And so it is something that's really interesting, Teresa, and something that is a regular part of our conversation. I have to say, he is really loving it right now. But at least in the conversations thus far, there seems to be an end date in mind, whether it's 1 or 2 years of coming back. But you never know, and I think we have to stay flexible around again what his personal journey is and what
Mhm.
his pivots will be as he experiences um, Japan.
Well, and I think as a parent, right, it's really hard to let them go on that journey. So talk to us about a little about how that, pivots into kind of your thoughts on fatherhood, right? In general, right? Because it's something I think all parents, I almost feel like sometimes it's like that codependency when they're home, like you depend on each other and now they go, right? If
Yeah,
that's the right term. And maybe that's not the right term with you, but I do think that's the right term with some parents. So can
yeah,
you talk a little about that with us?
yeah. I think there's a couple of things that, of course, whenever you have something like this, it makes you a little bit more introspective, right, and reflective. And so, one of the things that I didn't expect from this pivot is for me to think about other pivots that sort of help support this, right? Or create a foundation for this and the relationship that we have as a family. And so I think about my early work days when he was first born. And one of the pivots that sort of came to mind was when he was first born, I actually was commuting 4 days a week. And so I would leave on Monday mornings and come back home on Thursday nights and be exhausted from the travel and work and, spend work from home on a Friday. And so, you know, uh, spend time with him on Saturdays and Sundays. And I did this for, 3 or 4 years. And I just got to a point where I just said, you know what? Like, I'm not spending, the level of quality time with him. And for me personally, everyone has different, you know, decisions and different goals and objectives. And for me, that was a major pivot that said, hey, I need to do something to change my current work life balance to spend more time with him and be there for him more. And so I made a career change where I actually took a pay cut in order to be able to have more flexibility. It still allowed me to be engaged and um, um, focused on achieving some of the work stuff. But because I made that change, I was able to, do things like coach his basketball and, drive him to work a couple of times and have that discussion and have flexibility around um, what I would call traditions that we created in order to create this really close bond. And I'm really grateful and thankful that I had the flexibility, right? Not everyone has the flexibility to be able to make a pivot or in something like that. And so that was one of the things that came to mind. Another thing around the fatherhood is just how quickly time passes, right? It literally seems like it was a nanosecond ago, that he was in elementary and high school and college, and just sort of thinking back to how quickly, time flies. And then the last thing I would say around the fatherhood thing, which is again, the jury's still out, right? Which is um, have we provided him with sort of the tools, the resources, the knowledge, the support, the street smarts, right? In order to not just survive, but really thrive in this amazing opportunity. And so, uh, when this topic came up around the pivot and alignment with fatherhood, that was sort of the things that came to mind for me.
So beautiful with great shares. I wanted to reflect on the flexibility you talked about because I think, cool to hear you talk about, the gratefulness for the flexibility and honoring the fact that, that was something that you had available within your context, in your environment, and then you tapped into it. The flexibility to pivot maybe with more ease. I find that oftentimes, there is, even when we have circumstances that could flex, it's our inner rigidity that does not allow us to make the kind of change that you did. And so I don't disagree with you. There are a lot of folks out there where, sometimes I say as an expat myself, like I live in somebody else's, like definition of heaven. Like the things that are
Mm.
available to me today, the comfort and the flexibility and the fluidity of my experiences, like this to somebody else today is, an outstanding experience. But also when I think about this, like I'm living my own, vision and idea of seventh heaven when I was 10 years old, like 10 years old and or 14-year-old me, like this is amazing, right? So, but it's still on me today to recognize that and choose, the actions and the behaviors and the habits and and tap into some opportunities. I could, on the inside stay rigid and just let things kind of pass me by. And so I witnessed in what you were saying, um, you flexed because there was some awareness around that nanosecond, around the preciousness of time, preciousness of the present moment. And, you chose that bigger life that you and I sometimes talk about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I'm not quite sure where it came from, but at least
Yeah.
to me, I keep kind of an openness and try to have a growth mindset around everything. And so I think having that perspective allows you to um, not stay stuck and sort of again open yourself up to different possibilities and opportunities for sure.
So how do you see this then relative to your own um, history, family of origin,
Yeah.
multi-generational journey? Because, that's what I was tuning into that a little bit, thinking about, my own expat journey, some of the
Yeah.
conversations, you foreshadowed here. Tell us about the multi-generational aspect here of fatherhood and journey in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that, um, because of the emotion around it, you sort of think about um, generational opportunities, right? And so you sort of think about, okay, what opportunities your parents had, and it starts to think about, my grandfather and grandfather's opportunities, and what an immense um, sense of gratitude I is the only word, that we've created this environment for him to be able to experience something like this. And so you sort of start to think about your place on that multi-generational journey, right? And someone, I can't remember who said it or where I heard it, was you sort of think about your past, or the past, history, when you see your father or grandfather, and you think about the future when you see your children, and sort of that continuum of continuous timeline is something that gives you perspective.
Yeah, when I think about, my what my son is doing now, because I'm didn't go as far as, Japan, but he's in a different state. And so that's been, an interesting change here. And I think about his life and my life today, and I'm thinking about what we're doing is an answer to my ancestors' prayers. I don't have a better way to say it, and I don't know if they actually prayed, but when I'm thinking about some of the hardships that they went through, like this, what we're doing today is the answer to some of those, wishes for a better life, a life, lived differently and more,
Well,
with
I
more
was going to
peace
say
and ease.
yeah, I was
Does
going to
that
say
resonate with
something.
you, Teresa? I'm thinking
Yeah,
about you.
because yeah, because I was going to say something very similar, even you think about, I love that Michael put it in that framework, right? Because when you think about, and I love that he said generational opportunities, right? Because, I mean, my husband wouldn't be here if his parents, his great grandparents didn't come over, from Italy in, the 1920s, and, settle in the US, and they were young at the time, and they came over with their parents, of course, his grandparents. But you hear these stories about these young people who've come over by themselves, right, with nobody else, who were, so I do love that you talked about it that way, because I think it is important, right? And it's important to experience the world and experience other cultures and experience all those other things. So it's really great that you have that kind of feeling about it, Michael. So I really
Yeah,
do appreciate that.
absolutely. And there is sort of that immigrant story as part of my family as well. My grandfather immigrated from Trinidad. And so maybe there is something that's in the DNA that
Mm-hmm.
allows him to sort of have that worldview, or maybe um, me growing up and integrating some of those stories help create some of that perspective as well. So
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely incredible.
Are you going to get over there to see him? Is that on the plan? I know I'm going a little
Oh,
off script here, but now, but
no, absolutely.
why
We
not?
have it booked already,
Awesome.
and we're scheduled to go over in about 4 or 5 weeks.
That's amazing, and I think that's
Yeah,
a really great. And I'll be very
yeah,
interested to hear about that,
yeah,
because I'm
yeah,
interested in going there as well, and my family is
yeah,
as well. So it'll be a great story.
yeah.
So as we kind of wrap up today, can you talk a little about the next chapter for you, right? Your future pivots, especially as it relates to this, right? Is there anything that you've learned or any advice that you can give our listeners, right? Especially as it relates to this pivot.
Yeah, I think number one, and then I actually have two. One is something that I referenced earlier around just openness and flexibility, right? That you're stepping into this new time, this new period of life, just sort of keeping that awareness and openness and curiosity around how this pivot may create other opportunities for you. Number one. And then number two is, it's a yin and the yang, right? It's I'm so excited for this wonderful opportunity, but also there's the anxiety and angst, right, of not having this core part of your family with you, and being on the other side of the world for you. And so one of the things I do is every day, or every other day, or every couple of days, I try to read something called the 5 remembrances. And one of the items in the 5 is that all that is dear to me and everyone that I love are of the nature that change. There is no way to escape being separated from them, right? And I'll sort of end on that, right? It's kind of a natural progress of life, right? And just kind of reminding you that the natural course of life is to change and evolve. And that's helps get us through.
Well, it's awesome you said that. And you said 2 C words, curiosity and change. And
Yeah.
those are the things I really picked up out of what you said. And, curiosity is so important. Knowing what's around you and not, feeling like you're stuck, and maybe exploring something else is so important. And change. People do not like change. So the fact that I think you're embracing that to give him that opportunity is an amazing story. So um, thank you so much, Michael, for being here today, for sharing with us. We really do appreciate you being on Step Into the Pivot. Ivana, do you have any final things you want to say?
Yes, thank you, Michael. So much more we could talk about here. Lots of, this really was a little bit like a preview. Um, and, I'm just picturing you being hosted by your son, right? Because we're, the change here doesn't always mean that there is there isn't something else equally amazing being birthed at the same time as we're saying goodbye to a particular phase. I just finished a road trip with my son. That was, one of the bestest and coolest experiences we have ever had as a team, as a duo, right? And then we were able to share it with my partner, and then the trio was there, and there was so much love flowing. And this time last year, when I was in the midst of adjusting to our son going off to college, I didn't, if I was letting myself be in the rigidity around the change, not wanting the change, I couldn't have even imagined that this new version of, connection was going to be available, and that it was going to happen like chronologically after I said, I surrender to the ending. All
Right.
right.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a beautiful
So
story. Yeah, absolutely.
thank you. So, how are all these pivot steps forward for you? Did I miss that part because I was frozen? And Liam will
You
have to
did.
cut
You
this
did.
part out.
We
That
already
is
talked.
amazing. Well, okay, so that's beautiful. I think that Liam, who we invoked on this call, will have to do some editing and working through change and opportunity
Yeah.
to
No.
edit stuff out.
No,
Thank you for being mindful of my tech difficulties. I
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Yeah.
oh,
So that's it.
no, again, thank
I
you
just don't want
for
to end this conversation. It's too good.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you again, Michael, for being here today. Thank you to all of our listeners. We will see you on next week's Step Into the Pivot. And remember, if you have a pivot, step into it.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Step Into the Pivot. We hope you found inspiration and valuable insights from our conversation. Remember, life is a series of pivots, and it's in those moments of change that we truly grow.
If you enjoyed today's episode and want to stay connected, make sure to check out our websites. You'll find additional resources, behind-the-scenes content, and more details about our incredible guests. We love hearing from listeners, so reach out with your thoughts, questions, or your own pivot stories.
To keep the conversation going, be sure to follow us on social media. We're on LinkedIn and Instagram, where we share updates, quotes, and engage with our amazing community.
If you haven't already, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Your feedback makes a difference, and it helps us bring you meaningful conversations. We're signing off, reminding you that every pivot is a step forward. Take care, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Step Into the Pivot.